The golden hues of a Dallas sunset stretched across the city skyline, casting long shadows over the bustling streets as Nathan Cole navigated his sedan through the slow-moving evening traffic. The rhythmic tap of his fingers against the steering wheel matched the soft hum of blues playing from his car speakers, a deliberate choice to counter the stress of the day. It had been one of those seemingly endless workdays, back-to-back meetings, unread emails piling up, and last-minute reports that drained whatever energy he had left. But now, as he eased his grip on the wheel, he allowed himself to imagine the comfort of home. A warm meal, a cool drink, maybe a quiet moment on the balcony watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. He sighed, adjusting the air conditioning to ward off the lingering heat of the Texas summer. Just a few more minutes, and he would be there. Then, a sudden noise shattered his moment of peace. A sharp wail of sirens pierced through the melody on his speakers, and in the same instant, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. Nathan's body tensed. His gaze flickered toward the speedometer well within the limit. He hadn't run a red light. No illegal turns. No distractions. Nothing that could have warranted this. Yet, there they were, those unmistakable lights, signaling him to pull over. A familiar feeling crept into his chest, a tightness that wasn't from fear exactly, but from knowing. Knowing that no matter how careful he was, no matter how by the book he played it, moments like these always found him. With a controlled breath, he turned on his signal, maneuvered his car toward the curb, and shifted into park. He rolled down his window, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, his posture composed but firm. The police cruiser came to a stop behind him, its engine rumbling softly as the door creaked open. Nathan glanced in his side mirror, catching the officer's silhouette against the fading light of dusk. The man who stepped out was in his mid-40s, with a sharp buzz cut and a square jaw that made him look even more imposing. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a gleaming shine that reflected the streetlights above. Even before he spoke, his presence carried a weight of authority, the kind that didn't ask for control but expected it. Officer Travis Reed. Nathan had never met him before, but he recognized the type. He'd encountered men like him plenty of times, men whose expressions were carved from stone, whose eyes scanned every movement with a quiet, calculated scrutiny. Men who believed that a badge on their chest meant they didn't need to explain themselves. Nathan inhaled slowly, steadying himself as the officer approached. He wasn't going to panic. He wasn't going to assume the worst. But experience had taught him that nights like these had a way of turning into something else entirely. And tonight, everything was about to change. Reed swaggered toward the car with the kind of slow, deliberate confidence that came from years of authority going unquestioned. His boots crunched against the pavement as he approached, his right hand resting on the edge of his belt, close enough to his holster to send a message without saying a word. The streetlights above cast a harsh glow on his squared jaw and deep-set eyes, which held the kind of sharpness that made it clear he was assessing everything, every movement, every expression, every breath. Nathan kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his fingers barely flexing as he inhaled a steady breath. He'd been in this position before. He knew the rules, spoken and unspoken. Move slowly. Speak clearly. Give no reason for escalation. It was a delicate balance, a tightrope walk that too many people like him had learned to navigate. License and registration, Reed demanded, his voice clipped, devoid of warmth or politeness. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Nathan complied with deliberate precision. No sudden movements. He reached toward the glove compartment, popped it open, and retrieved the documents, his motions controlled and practiced. As he handed them over, he could feel Reed's eyes on him, more than just looking, scrutinizing, searching for something. Anything. A reason to justify what this really was. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Reed asked, his tone shifting slightly, the words drawn out just enough to let the question settle uncomfortably in the space between them. He leaned in closer, his presence now pressing against the edge of personal space. An invisible line crossed as if daring Nathan to react. Nathan met his gaze in the side mirror, but kept his face unreadable, his voice even. "I'm not entirely sure, officer." Reed exhaled sharply through his nose. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light." A slight flicker in his tone, hesitation, uncertainty, maybe even doubt was all Nathan needed to hear. He knew what this was. A minor infraction at best, something most drivers would be waved off for, or maybe receive a quick warning. But this wasn't about traffic laws. This wasn't routine. Nathan let the accusation hang for a beat, then simply nodded. I see. Reed's expression shifted as he glanced down at the license. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightening just slightly. You're not from around here, are you? Nathan hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he understood what was really being asked. Not where he lived. Not what was printed on his ID. Something else. I moved here a few months ago, Nathan replied, his tone neutral. My address is on the license. But Reed wasn't listening, not really. His eyes remained locked on the name, the photo, the details that suddenly seemed to matter more than the supposed traffic violation. The gears in his mind were turning, working towards something beyond what had brought them to this moment. Nathan recognized the shift instantly. The stop was no longer about an incomplete stop at the light. It never had been. Reed was looking for something. Justification. A reason to turn a routine encounter into something more. Nathan had seen it before, the subtle shift in posture, the way the air changed when an officer decided they wanted the situation to escalate. He could feel it in the weight of Reed's silence, in the way his fingers flexed against his belt, in the calculated way his gaze moved between Nathan and the inside of the car. A moment stretched between them, a moment where everything still had the potential to remain just that: a stop, a citation, a warning, or something else entirely. Nathan's pulse remained steady, his breath even, but he knew this night wasn't over. Not yet. Where were you headed in such a hurry? Reed's voice cut through the night air, his tone laced with something more than just casual curiosity. Nathan remained calm. He had to be. Just going home. The words were simple, neutral, but in the space between them, an unspoken battle was already taking shape. Reed wasn't convinced. He lingered, studying Nathan's face as though he expected to find the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. His narrowed eyes, the slow tap of his fingers against his belt, the slight shift in his stance, it was all part of the silent game, the measuring of power. Nathan could feel the tension thickening. He'd seen this play out before. Reed exhaled sharply, then, almost casually, tucked Nathan's license and registration into his chest pocket. The move was subtle, but deliberate. A smirk played at his lips. Step out of the car for me. Nathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a fraction of a second before he consciously released it. His face remained neutral, his expression unreadable. Is there a specific reason, officer? Reed's lips twitched slightly, an almost amused expression flickering across his face. I asked you to step out of the car. His voice lowered just enough to turn the words into something else. Not a request. A command. A threat wrapped in forced patience. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Nathan inhaled slowly. He could feel his pulse, steady but present, a rhythmic reminder of how crucial control was in moments like these. Without another word, he unclipped his seatbelt, pushed open the door, and stepped out. He was taller than Reed, broader in the shoulders. His tailored suit, crisp white shirt, and polished shoes marked him as someone who didn't belong in a lineup of usual suspects. A professional. A man who carried himself with purpose. But none of that seemed to matter right now. Not to Reed. Hands where I can see them. Nathan complied, lifting his hands slightly away from his body in a practiced, careful motion. He had nothing to hide, but that had never stopped a situation like this from escalating before. Reed smirked, though his eyes held something colder. Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. Can't be too careful. Nathan tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with the officer. The statement was vague, purposefully so, but he wasn't going to let it slide without acknowledgement. Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Nathan asked, his voice level, measured. Or does this have to do with something else? The question landed like a punch. For the first time, Reed stiffened, his easy smirk faltering just slightly. His fingers twitched near his belt, a reflexive move, a silent warning. Watch your tone, he muttered, the edge of authority creeping back into his voice. Nathan didn't flinch. I'm simply asking a question. Reed stepped closer, his body language shifting from relaxed authority to something more predatory. His shoulders squared, his posture aggressive. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works." His voice was softer now, laced with something almost mocking. "You got something to hide?" A slow silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. "No, officer," Nathan finally replied, his voice steady. "I just believe in transparency." Reed scoffed, pacing slightly, circling Nathan in a way that felt less like standard procedure and more like a test. He was sizing him up, waiting for the reaction that hadn't come. Nathan wasn't reacting the way Reed expected. No fear, no stammering, just control, poise and unsettling calm that put the officer on edge. "You seem pretty confident," Reed muttered. "Like you think you know what's going to happen next." Nathan didn't blink. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." For the first time, Reed flinched. The smirk disappeared entirely, his confidence wavering, if only for a second. It was subtle, just a flicker, but Nathan caught it. The power dynamic was shifting, and then Reed doubled down. "Turn around. Hands on the hood. I need to check for weapons." Nathan exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. "Weapons?" His tone remained incredulous but composed. "Do I look like someone carrying a weapon?" "I'm not going to ask you again." There it was. The final line. The place where refusal would turn into resistance, and resistance would turn into justification. Nathan could hear it in the tightening of Reed's voice, the coiled readiness in his stance. A flicker of something unreadable passed over Nathan's face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms against the hood of his car. The metal was still warm from the heat of the day, but that wasn't what Nathan focused on. It was the weight of the moment, the way Reed's hands moved over him. Rough, invasive, lingering longer than necessary. An assertion of dominance, not necessity. The search yielded nothing. "You're clean," Reed muttered, almost disappointed. Nathan straightened, smoothing down his jacket as he turned back to face him. His expression was cool, unreadable. "Of course I am." But Reed wasn't done. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do," he said, his eyes narrowing again. "Care to explain why?" Nathan folded his arms across his chest. His stance was relaxed, unconcerned. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said smoothly. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Reed's eyes darkened. He didn't like that answer. He didn't like Nathan's control over the situation. He didn't like how unshaken he was. "That's so?" he pressed. "You a lawyer or something?" Nathan smiled faintly. "Or something." Reed exhaled sharply, the frustration barely masked now. He had been waiting for intimidation to work, waiting for the moment Nathan would break, would give him a reason. But that moment hadn't come. Nathan watched the internal struggle play out in the officer's face. The flicker of doubt. The consideration of pushing further. The realization that there was no justification. Finally, Reed reached into his pocket, pulled out Nathan's license and registration, and held them out. "Drive safe," he said flatly. Nathan took the documents, his fingers brushing against Reed's for the briefest second. A silent exchange, a quiet acknowledgement of the power struggle that had just unfolded. As he stepped back toward his car, he didn't rush. He didn't fumble. He didn't let Reed see anything other than what he had shown from the start: poise, control, and an unwavering certainty that tonight, he had been the one in charge. He slid back into the driver's seat, started the engine, and as he pulled away, he caught one last glimpse of Reed in his rearview mirror. The officer was still standing there, watching, and Nathan knew this wasn't just about a stop. It never had been. Reed stepped closer, his boots scraping against the pavement, his body radiating barely contained aggression. His voice dropped to a near growl, low and dangerous. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Nathan met his gaze without flinching. His heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled. He had spent his life navigating moments like these, and this was no different. "I don't think anything, officer," Nathan replied, his voice smooth, even. "I believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." Reed's jaw tightened, the vein in his neck pulsing as his fingers twitched near his belt. His control was slipping, unraveling at the edges. There was no mistaking what this was anymore. The so-called traffic violation had faded into the background, replaced by something uglier, something raw, unspoken, and deeply ingrained. Reed exhaled sharply through his nose. His lips parted, and the words spilled out before he could catch them. "People like you always." He stopped, but it was too late. The words had already hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Nathan's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but the change was there. His head tilted slightly, his eyes sharpening as he studied Reed with a quiet intensity. "People like me?" His voice was soft, but razor-sharp, slicing through the space between them. Reed bristled. His entire body tensed, his hands balling into fists for just a second before he forced them open again. He had said too much, and he knew it. His mouth pressed into a tight line, but his silence spoke louder than words. "You know what I mean," Reed muttered, his voice losing some of its previous bravado. "I think I do," Nathan replied, his tone still measured, unwavering. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." The silence between them stretched, heavy and oppressive. The tension was thick enough to cut. For the first time since the encounter began, Reed didn't have a response. His carefully crafted control, the dominance he had assumed, the power he had wielded so easily, was slipping through his fingers like sand. Nathan held the moment, letting the weight of it settle. Then, finally, he spoke a final revelation, one that would alter the balance of power completely. "I think it's time you know who I am." Reed scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "I don't care who you are." But the words rang hollow, lacking the same force they once had. Nathan reached into his pocket with slow, deliberate movements. He knew better than to rush. He could see the way Reed's fingers twitched, see the momentary flash of instinct warning him to act, to escalate. "I'm reaching for my badge." His voice was calm, unshaken. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, a declaration that cut through the remaining layers of pretense. A smooth, worn leather wallet emerged. With a practiced motion, Nathan flipped it open. The badge gleamed under the dimming sunlight, catching the golden hues of the setting Dallas sky. Nathan Cole, head of internal affairs, Dallas Division. Reed froze. The moment stretched impossibly long, as if time itself had decided to take a breath. The color drained from Reed's face, his usual confident swagger unraveling right in front of Nathan's eyes. His mouth opened slightly, then shut. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his mind clearly racing to process what was happening. He had been in control until he wasn't. Nathan took a step forward, closing the space between them. Not in aggression, not in intimidation, just enough to make sure Reed understood exactly where they stood now. "And now, Officer Reed," Nathan's voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. "Let's talk about accountability." Reed's entire body went rigid. Nathan had seen this reaction before. The moment of reckoning. The moment when someone who had spent their career unchecked, unchallenged, suddenly realized they had been seen. Exposed. The arrogance, the entitlement, it had all crumbled in an instant, replaced with something that almost resembled fear. Nathan watched as Reed's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. A way to backpedal. A way to regain control. But there was none. Nathan could hear the shift in Reed's breathing, shorter, shallower. He was cornered, and he knew it. "You," Reed started, his voice hoarse. "This is some kind of—" He stopped, shaking his head, as if trying to find the right words. "You set me up." Nathan let out a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You pulled me over," he reminded him. "You made this what it was." Reed's nostrils flared, his hands still hovering near his belt like a man clinging to the last vestiges of power. But power, Nathan knew, was only real if the other person allowed it to be. And right now, Reed had none. Nathan didn't move, didn't blink. He simply held the officer's gaze, waiting. For a long moment, Reed just stood there, his face a war zone of conflicting emotions: anger, disbelief, fear. Then, slowly, his hands dropped to his sides. Nathan nodded slightly. "That's the first smart decision you've made tonight," he said, his voice almost conversational. Reed clenched his jaw, his chest rising and falling as he worked to contain whatever storm was raging inside him. "This doesn't have to get worse," Nathan continued. "But it will if you don't start thinking carefully about your next moves." Reed exhaled sharply, looking away for the first time. Nathan took another step back, giving him space. "This is what's going to happen," Nathan said, his tone authoritative but not unkind. "I'm going to get back in my car, and I'm going to drive away. You're going to think very hard about the choices you've made tonight." Reed's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. Nathan held his gaze for another beat. "And then, Officer Reed, we're going to have a conversation?" A flicker of something resignation maybe crossed Reed's face. Nathan gave him one last look, then turned, moving back toward his car. He could feel Reed's eyes on him, could sense the turmoil, the unraveling. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and let the moment linger just a little longer. Then, with a smooth, practiced motion, he pulled away from the curb, leaving Reed standing there, frozen in the fading light. As he drove, Nathan allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The night had changed everything, but the real reckoning had only just begun.